Okay, we're here on another episode of The Witness Stand, which means we also have another esteemed guest. Hi, Chris. Thank you so
Hey,
much for joining us. I know how busy most academics are at the moment. Dr. Chris Street is an academic, a reader at the University of Huddersfield. But, Chris, why don't you tell us more about yourself? Please just tell us a bit about you and your research.
about me. Wow. Okay, I didn't expect that. Well, I don't know if you'll be able to guess from the accent, but I'm Welsh. I'm from the valleys in Wales originally. Did my undergraduate in Scotland. Went to do my PhD at UCL in London, and it was there that I switched topics. Initially, I was really interested in the idea of actually a very simple idea, which is if I had a coin on me, I would show you. Which is just simply you take a coin in your hand, right, and you go, which hand is the coin in? Which one? And that
Okay.
decision really fascinated me as a child because there's no information there. So, how do you make a decision? And I think even today that still fascinates me. How do you make any kind of decision there? So, I became interested in behaviorism, which is this beautiful system that just says, there's an input to a human, there's an output. And you take this really complex phenomena, the human being, and you boil it down to input output. I just love the elegance of that, and I still do. I'm not a behaviorist anymore. I moved into vision, trying to understand how do we say pick up cups of tea, and actually cups of tea were and still are really the bread and butter of visual perception research. Surprising how interested they really are in that. There's lots and lots of papers on picking up cups of tea. Um, and then I did my PhD in London, and we changed topic drastically. And that's the work that I'm doing today. It's shifted from visual perception into lie detection. So that's kind of my main research area now. A little bit of a weird
Quite a big
shift.
change.
Um,
Mm.
that was because we had an undergraduate in the lab at the time who kind of wanted to become an MI6 spy. So her mother thought, like James Bond, that means sleeping around with people, right? So you can't do that.
Of
So
course.
next best thing, study deception. And none of us knew anything about deception. So I started reading around it and just found very basic questions in cognitive psychology that were not being addressed in this area. Questions like that, how do you make a decision? Given two bits of information, basically you can't tell the difference between them. How do you make a decision? Very simple question to ask, but it just wasn't being tackled. So that grabbed my interest. And for 3 years, for my PhD, I was exploring just that question: how do we decide lie or truth? I then went on to do my postdoc in Vancouver for a year and a half, and I formalized something they call the adaptive lie detector theory that I'm sure we'll speak more about later. Um, and then I joined Huddersfield, which is where I am now and have been since 2015. Currently a reader in cognitive psychology. Don't ask me what that means because I don't know. Nobody knows. Uh, uh, but yes, that's what I do. I'm a sort of cognitive psychologist exploring how do we decide whether someone's lying or telling the truth. But I also do work on unconscious lie detection, and I still keep my hand in with some vision stuff as well.
That's quite a leap to go from, how what hand is the coin into? Is that person a liar? I mean, I must admit, it's so interesting what you're looking at now, the applications of what you're looking at as well.
Mm,
And detecting deception and the approaches to it is something that interests a lot of my students. I know that for a fact.
right.
Often what people want to know is, can you detect deception? But before we kind of get into that, I mean, let's just start with this whole idea of deception and detecting it. Um, a lot of people are often they underestimate how often they are exposed to lies or how frequently people do lie. Now, as somebody who's constantly assessing people's approaches to detecting deception, is there a number that is there a specific frequency that we've been able to figure out in terms of how often people lie?
Right. Well, yeah. So there's been a little bit of research on this. So what we know at the moment, at least what we think we know at the moment, is that on average, people tend to lie about twice a day, thereabouts, or maybe once a day, which sounds like quite a lot, really. You think of all the conversations you have, and do you really lie once every day? That does feel like quite a lot, I think. Um,
Mm.
Speaking from personal experience here, actually, during my PhD, I ended up with a little sort of A6 notepad in the back of my back pocket here, along with like a counter, those counters they use for nightclubs. So
Yeah,
I kept
yeah,
track
yeah.
of the number of conversations I had. I defined that in a particular way, and I kept track of the lies in my book. And I actually lied a lot more than once per day. I was really surprised by that.
Really.
And here's the thing: this average number is not a great number to work from, because it's really skewed. So if you know anything about statistics, you know that it isn't necessarily the case that everyone is at the average. There'll be some people who are less, some people who are more. We tend to think, there'll be kind of some will be more, some will be less. But sometimes it can be really skewed so that most people will be telling no lies at all. But then there's a small group of people, like 5% of people, who tell about 50% of the lies. So that is like just a very small group of people telling half the lies being told ever. And so when you average those things out, you get to 2 lies per day for all of us, 1 to 2 lies per day. But really, we're probably closer to 0. And it's just that there's a small group of people who keep telling lots and lots of lies. That I'm sure we all know someone like that, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. In my head, what I'm finding interesting at the moment is this idea of you as a student speaking to people and just clicking every time. Does my shirt look nice? Absolutely, click.
So here's the thing: the clicks were for true conversations. So that was because at the time, and still to this date, really, these measures are simply a raw frequency. How many times do you lie? What it doesn't tell you is what proportion of your conversations are lies.
Right.
And to know that, you need to know, well, how many are true, how many are lies. So of all the conversations you have, how often do you lie? And that just seemed more interesting to me. So the clicks were my attempt to track new conversations. That was rather tricky, and obviously it was rather informal. And then the notebook would come out every so often, and people would give me looks and ask what I'm writing. But I usually put in enough of a delay there for it to not cause too much issue. But yeah, a lot of people knew that I was doing it. And so when they saw the notebook come out, they were, slightly concerned.
A little sus, what's he writing about me?
Yeah.
Completely unrelated. I remember once I went to a bar and it was at night time and I needed somewhere to do some work and I wanted to leave my hotel. And I got my notebook out, just at the bar, just wanted to go somewhere else. And there was loads of like student age people, going out. And they looked at me and I must have looked like some sort of creep because there was a bubble around me of people pointing at me going, why is that weirdo writing notes while we're trying to have a good time? So yeah, nightclub's not a place to get a notebook out. Anyway, I digress. But yeah, and I assume the majority of these lies are in fact white lies or no, is it quite a mix that you get?
So these lies can be quite varying. And talking from my personal experience with that notepad, I mean, some of them were so extreme that I wasn't prepared to write them down. Should someone find a notebook?
Oh, really?
I found it really surprising how far I would go sometimes. But no, those lies, so they rule out certain types of lies. Sometimes, yes, they are white lies. Depends on what you mean by a white lie exactly. But any, not quite a butler lie either, but any kind of lie that is intended just to let the conversation progress is usually not considered in these studies. So if you say, hey, how you doing? And I say, yeah, I'm all right. That's a pretty typical sort of Welsh introduction. It kind of goes, all right. That's how we tend to do it in Wales. And yeah, that even though I'm saying I'm fine, I might not be fine. But that wouldn't be considered a lie. So there's a set of instructions that say these sort of conversational aids, they don't count as lies, even though they're not factually true. But yeah, they can be quite wide varying. And honestly, I don't know what the numbers are of white lies relative to more serious lies. But yeah, it could be beyond white lies. It might be more than that and more serious.
Okay, so it could be far more serious lies. You've just made me think as well, the whole idea of saying to somebody, you're all right. I realized that is a weird thing to say to people in North America. I said it at a conference. I said, you're all right. And the response was, I'm fine. Why are you asking? Then I realized in the UK, it's more significant.
I've certainly found it up here as well, I'll be honest with you. So in Yorkshire, I find it too, in Huddersfield. I'll sometimes say, all right, and people will give me a long response. And I think, oh, yeah, right, of course. I asked them, how are they? How are they doing? And yeah, they want to give me a proper response to that. Yeah. So I'm starting to train myself into just waiting now. Or to stop saying
you've just got to identify those ones that will chew your ear off. And just
unfortunately, I'm now a mixture of sort of Yorkshire and Welsh. I go, hey up, you're right. That's my current introduction, which is sort of Yorkshire.
You're blending in. Welsh. You're blending in now.
Yeah,
so that's good. That's great. Okay, so people do lie on a daily basis, but many people very low numbers. But then we have the pathological liars. Now, moving on more to a closer look at what you do, I guess the one pressing question I've wanted to ask you for this interview was this: how do people attempt to spot lies? And not necessarily what's correct, but in your research, in your experience, how do people try and distinguish liars from truth tellers?
Yeah, so that for me is the interesting question. That is the question I care about. And it's something we don't know all that much about, to be fair, because let's say, well, people have been interested in deception for thousands of years. You can go way, way back to methods of trying to detect deception. But sort of as a formal science, psychology sort of establishes around 1900s. And then it's really only to around, well, I guess in 1920s as well, we're certainly seeing the invention of the polygraph and so on. But come 1960s, the psychologists amongst us will know that that's kind of the start of cognitivism, the idea of humans aren't just simply ring a bell and they'll salivate like the dog. There isn't just simply an input and an output. There's something going on in the middle, right? The cognition, the thought. And so around the 1960s, that's kind of where lie detection research really starts to ramp up. But it being what it was, the interest was always in how do we detect deception? That was always the question. How do we get the right answer? And it's not really until quite recently we started to ask the question you're asking there, which is how do we make any kind of decision? Whether it's the right decision or the wrong decision, how do we come to a decision? So come, let's say about the 90s then, there's a theory in psycholinguistics called the Spinoza mind theory. And this is kind of where we begin, really, as an explanation of how do we make that decision, in my opinion. Other people have other opinions, but I think that's really where it starts with this particular theory. And it says, so imagine, well, actually, don't imagine anything. I'm just going to say a sentence to you, okay? The pink elephant bounces on the ball, right? There's a sentence. So it's kind of hard not to think of a pink elephant bouncing on a ball when you hear those kinds of sentences, right? You sort of simulate something like it. It might not be a clear picture in your head, but you're certainly forming some sort of representation of the words I've said in order to be able to understand what I'm saying, right? To construct that as a sentence that has some sort of meaning. So the Spinoza mind theory begins from that perspective. It's a linguistic theory. How do we understand language? And it says, well, initially you've got no choice but to believe everything. That's just the way your mind is structured. You can't help it. So if I say to you, I went to France last week, I could be telling the truth, I could be lying. So lie detection researchers borrowed this psycholinguistic theory and said, perhaps what's happening here is that we automatically believe everything. You can't help that, at least initially. And then if you have time, or if you have some ability, some sort of cognitive resource, some mental capacity, that is, to overcome that initial automatic belief and to reflect on it, give it some thought, you might then think maybe it's a lie. But initially you have to believe everything. So that's
so by default, we're almost driven to believe new information is being truthful.
Well, that's, yeah, possibly, right? So this is where things start. And yeah, I guess that's one of the core phenomena we are fairly confident in this field about. There are only two, I would say. And one of them is that if we're going to make a guess, we're probably going to guess truth rather than guess they're lying. That's the way we tend to go with it. And that theory is kind of the starting point of explaining why that is the case.
Interesting. And is this consistent across all people? I mean, for example, let's say we have somebody who is currently in prison.
Yeah.
Somebody who's surrounded by criminals, somebody who may, from a young age been, adopted a criminal identity. Are they going to be as likely to have this truth bias, maybe a default truth bias?
So, yeah, I think that's a totally sensible question, right? Because these people are involved in a very different situation where in their lives they may be experiencing lots of lies, and potentially the stakes of those lies might differ. To me, asking how you're doing today, right? Those stakes are very different. The situation is different.
Right.
So there is that question of, is there a context dependency? Now, as I said, there are two findings we think we know about. I'll tell you what the other one is. The other one is that we're pretty bad at it. We're really bad at detecting lies. We suck at it. So we're pretty much as good as a coin flip, but we'll probably come back to that later.
Yeah.
For now, we're just thinking about, how do we make that decision? And we tend to think that, yeah, people are biased to guess truth. That is, if they're given a statement, they will say truth. And because of that Spinoza mind theory that we began with, and really because of, I imagine, partly because of Kahneman and Tversky's kind of seminal work on heuristics and biases in the 80s that infected almost every era of psychology, I think we then give it the name truth bias, and it kind of gives it imbues it with additional meaning. It gives the sense of that is something that is happening in your head that you can't help. It's something that's hardwired into the way that you think. But what we're doing in my lab is something quite different. We're arguing actually it isn't necessarily a hardwired bias. Instead, it might actually be quite context dependent,
I
like
thought so.
prisoners, right? So this is kind of where the adaptive lie detector theory comes from. So that's a perspective I published in 2015, developed throughout my PhD, and I think it mostly developed from the fact that findings just weren't making sense based on what the theories were claiming. So, and then we got to the point of trying to falsify those theories, and it was very difficult to see what was happening. But from a lie detection point of view, what we knew at that point. But if you take a step back and think about decision making more broadly speaking, regardless of whether it's deception or not, just looking at decision making work, what you see in that research line is that people are actually relatively rational. And I say relatively because there's limits on what we can do. We are not computers, right? We can't process all the information around us at once.
Absolutely.
And we don't always have perfect information anyway. So, we're relatively rational, but with the information we have, we tend to do sensible things. Taking it to a very basic perspective, I'm drinking tea because I'm thirsty, right? So we tend to do things that make sense.
Yeah.
When it goes down decision-making route, then we see something called Bayesian decision-making. And this makes claims about we use multiple bits of information and we integrate them in the way that makes the most sense that we can currently. So the adaptive lie detector theory borrows from there. And what it says is, I probably should have prepped this, and I didn't think to do it. But what the theory will say is that if you have a good bit of information about the statement I'm making right now, you'll use that to make a decision. Right? I haven't forgot your question about the prism. I'm getting there.
Mm.
So it begins by saying, if there's good information about this statement, you'll use that. So I'm going to say, so last month I went to France. I went to the top of the Eiffel Tower, took a selfie there with some people I met there, just a group of 3 people. We also had like these little champagne flutes, and that's my story. Okay, there's my tale. So what information relates directly to that statement? Well, it could be my body language, the way I'm behaving. It could be whether I appear nervous, whether I happen to trip up over my words, and so on, right? All these cues that we tend to think of, it turns out, aren't really useful. They do relate to what I'm saying, just turns out they don't give the liar away. These verbal and non-verbal cues, they tend not to be very good at detecting deception. What else could you use? Well, at the time of recording right now, we are currently in COVID lockdown, right? So it's a little bit tricky for me to last month have gone to France and taken a selfie with 3 or 4 people. So that is still information that is specific to this statement that you could use. And that's fairly reliable, right?
Yeah.
So you could make use of that information to make a decision. And it would probably make sense to guess I was lying there, in which case I was. That was a lie. But often we don't have that kind of information. Usually we don't have good information about this specific statement because people usually won't say something as obviously wrong as that clearly contradicts a global pandemic, right? So instead, we have to make a guess. And what do we do when we make that guess? Well, rather than look at this specific statement, we think about statements in general. And this is where the prism context comes in important. Because for you, me, and most people watching this, they will have what's called a truth bias. That is, they bias to guess people are telling the truth. But other people who, say, live in a context where most people will lie to them, they actually show the opposite. They show a lie bias, a bias to guess things are lies.
Right.
Turns out if I train you to detect deception, so I say, here are 10 cues to detect deception. You don't get better at detecting deception, but you do become more biased to guess people are lying. And if I train other people to guess, to show, these are the cues that tell you they're telling the truth. They don't get better at detecting it, but they do start guessing truth.
Interesting.
If I put you in front of a salesperson, well, it turns out salespeople are given manuals that tell them how to be manipulative. Again, we tend to be biased to guess that maybe they're lying. So it becomes kind of contextually dependent then. So whereas the field to this date has pretty much said there are 2 things we know for certain. You have low accuracy and you are biased to believe others. What we're arguing is actually we're challenging that second one, that you are biased to believe others. And actually what we're finding is that in certain circumstances, you can be very heavily biased to guess people are lying. And to take that to a little bit of a silly extreme, but nonetheless, it goes to show how sensible this approach is, in my opinion. Think about Pinocchio's nose. If you got a perfect piece of information like Pinocchio's nose, it grows every time he lies, never grows when he tells the truth. If you have something like that available to you, it would be bonkers to guess someone's telling the truth. Right? The information is so clear that that person has lied. To guess anything but lie would be madness. So, if there is some kind of wealth to the idea that people have this cognitive default that they can't help but believe people are telling the truth, show them Pinocchio's nose, and they should keep guessing truth, right? Because that's an inbuilt bias. But that isn't what we're finding. We show people cues that are really indicative that they're lying, and guess what? They guess that they're lying, as you'd imagine. So yeah, coming in these different contexts can affect the bias, and indeed many different things can. So going in the other direction, rather than thinking about a more deceptive environment, think about your family. If you're speaking with your family, people often think they'll be better able to detect the deception there. Turns out that isn't necessarily the case. Instead, they just become more truth biased. They're more biased to believe them. And that might be because of the nature of the situation in which they're operating in. You don't want to be in relationships where people are saying, you're a liar. That's just aggressive. That's not very nice. So, yeah, so there's certainly a context dependency to all this.
It's interesting that the last thing you said fits in with some research that have been done around eyewitnesses, which similarly they found that eyewitnesses conform to their co-witnesses more frequently if their co-witnesses are family members or friends, because again of this whole idea of they're more trusting towards them and they're more willing to accept anything that a familiar co-witness says. And I mean, the theory that you've worked on and brought out, it makes a lot of sense because it is highly context dependent, depending on the person, what you know about them. But you said something very interesting there, Chris. You said if you teach people or give them a manual of how to detect deception, they're not going to get any better, you said. Instead, they'll just be more likely to accuse someone of being a liar. And this brings me on to my next question, because especially in the media, most lay people have grown to believe that there are these distinct cues that will tell you if someone's a liar. Poker players talk about it. Movies such as Meet the Parents. The guy's marrying a girl and her dad is a CIA lie detector who can look into someone's eyes. And we always hear about this misinformation possibly that's shared. If somebody looks to the top right corner, they're lying. If they touch their ear, they're lying. So my next question to you is this. Are behavioral cues, such as touching one's nose, touching one's ears, looking up, are any of these cues actually advantageous and reliable indicators of deception, or is it a myth?
There's a short answer to this, and the short answer is that they're just not useful at all.
Interesting.
The longer answer, I suppose, is that so let's turn to the research, and because we certainly see this everywhere, right? We see this pervading self-help bookshelves. There have been even recent TV shows. I mean, we're talking about what's the name of that show again? The film with Robert De Niro. What are you talking about?
Meet the Parents and Meet the Fockers.
I said, yeah, I can remember.
How to pronounce that correctly?
Yeah. Well, I'll be honest with you. I can remember the name of the second one, and I didn't want to say that on camera.
So, all right. Yeah, don't worry. I'll take the blame. That's an O. That's an O.
So there's those films. There are even recent TV shows. Lie to Me with Tim Roth and so on, right? That still push this. ITV's Liar. So there are certainly many areas of popular media that we see where we get this impression that here are 5 ways to detect a liar. And that's usually how it comes out. Here are 5 ways to detect some sort of clickbaity list approach to it. But the important thing to do here is that more so than any other area, I would say, deception stuff, if you come across anything like that, the important thing to do is to check to see if they're citing research. So what they'll do is they'll write the researchers' names and the year of publication at the point where they're making the claim. And at the end of the article, they should actually give the full title of that article. So then you can go out and find that article and check their claim. Now, I know that seems a little bit convoluted and why would I do that? I haven't got time to do all that. But unless they're providing that opportunity for checking, then there's really no reason to believe what they're saying. And in this case, unfortunately, there is so much misinformation out there that it's better to be skeptical towards that information than it is to accept it at face value. So when we do look at the research, what do we find? Well, the classic meta-analysis in this area. So a meta-analysis is when, let's say, you and 5 other people watching this video end up running your own experiments in your own research labs. You'll collect, say, 100 people, and you look for cues to deception. Do people look up and to the left? And all 6 of you run that same experiment. And 2 of you maybe find that yes, they do, and 4 of you find no, they don't. Well, that's kind of interesting. So what do we learn from that? Well, this meta-analysis, it brings together all those studies and says, what do we learn collectively from all these studies? Maybe those 2 were just oddball, just random chance happened to find something that wasn't really a pattern. In the way that when we look up into the clouds, we'll see patterns, but they aren't really patterns. Right? They're just clouds randomly moving, and we interpret them as real patterns, but they're not. So this meta-analysis brings together many studies and says this is our best view of the world, because it's kind of the biggest sample we can get of the population.
Brings it together, yeah.
And what we find there is that these visual cues, they're certainly useless.
Interesting.
It's so if I were to present you with, this is going to sound like a slightly weird example, but I'm stealing it from a very famous statistician. So it's not my weird example. But if I were to present you with a height, so let's say I give you 1.6 meters, right? Or let's say 5 foot 6. I have no idea if that's the correct conversion. It's probably not, but it won't be too far out, I imagine. There's a height. I ask you, is that person, knowing just that, are they a 13-and-a-half-year-old girl or are they a 14-year-old girl? That's the decision you have to make. That's an incredibly difficult decision to make, right? I mean, how could you make that decision? It's 6 months between them. And we know that, many 13-and-a-half-year-old girls can be taller than 14-year-old girls, and they vary drastically in height anyway. But if we took the whole population, we would find in general the 14-year-olds will be slightly taller than 13-and-a-half-year-olds, ever so slightly, as a rule. Even though any given pair, the 13-year-old could easily be much more taller than the 14-year-old. So that's kind of what we're working with when we're talking about cues to deception. They're really, really infrequent. And when they are present, it's the same as trying to make that decision between the 14-and-a-half and a 13-and-a-half-year-old. It's that same decision. Is this a lie or a truth? Is this a 13-and-a-half-year-old or a 14-year-old? It's the same level of difficulty. That's how poor these cues are. So that's what our 2003 meta-analysis told us. However, coming to quite a recent reanalysis within past few months, or maybe it's been longer than that. I'm starting to lose track of time now, I'll be honest with you.
We all have.
But yes, certainly within the recent period, there has been a reanalysis of some of this. And there's been an argument that actually, even those behaviors that we thought might be infrequent and really bad aren't actually there at all. They just don't exist. And that it was a result of something to do with the statistics that were being done at that point. Not a problem with the statistics. It was just, we've kind of moved on from there. And so we're now at a position where we'd say, well, visual cues, they're not helpful at all. So if you're expecting someone to cross their arms or scratch their nose, or the one I usually hear is look up and to the left. That's the one I hear these days. But the other popular one is just avoiding eye contact. These are not good cues of deception. Lies show them equally as often as truth tellers. And indeed, there have been 1 or 2 studies showing the opposite, where liars try to maintain eye contact because they believe that's a cue. But it just turns out it's not a useful indicator at all. If we go to the verbal information, the actual, let's go to the paraverbal. And the paraverbal is the stuff that accompanies your speech. So the tone.
Such as?
The tone, the pitch, whether I'm wavering in my voice. So I could do all those things without saying any words, right? So those things are also not massively helpful. So you might imagine maybe wavering and so on. When we move to the verbal, there might be information. And there are different ways in which we might try to assess that. There's something called reality monitoring. This is somewhat easy to do, but it still takes a bit of training to do it properly. And here you're looking for cues that relate to people's thoughts. So do they mention what they call cognitive operations? Do they mention things like, I think, I thought, I saw? These are all things that happen in people's heads. So the more of these kind of details they're mentioning, the more believable that statement is. Do they mention sounds and so on? So they have a set of criteria on which they're measuring. And then there's a slightly more complicated, well, I say slightly more, much more complicated one called CBCA, criteria-based content analysis. But this one is so complicated that they tend not to use it in practice. It takes a lot of work. But they do use it in Germany, largely because that's where it was developed. And they do use it in the courts there because it is thought to be quite reliable. But there are certainly people who criticize it and say, actually, it's not reliable. So, but you can imagine that the content is going to be helpful because think if you're watching this, think of a time where you think you detected a lie. And that might be quite difficult. You might actually need to hit pause and think about that because I can't think of one. But usually what people will say is one of two things. Either I've seen some physical evidence in the world that tells me that's wrong. So, Trump's, at the moment, Donald Trump has recently lost the election at the time of recording. So there is a fair amount of evidence to that effect. So when someone starts saying, I've won the election, there's reason to be skeptical. And that's because the evidence contradicts it, yes? So there's that. The other one is that there is some third party who tells you something that contradicts it. So, Amreen tells me they can't come out tonight, they can't go partying, whatever. They need to help their mother. And then maybe when I go to the shop later, I bump into the mother and she tells me actually she's going out, she's going to a concert. So those things contradict each other. Amreen can't be helping her mother out in the house if the mother's out at the concert. So those, and both of those, they kind of have to come through either the content of the speech, because they are things people are saying, or the physical piece of evidence, CCTV footage, photographs, and so on. If we're going to have any hope, that's probably where it lies. It's within the verbal content, what people are actually saying, not passively observing. And indeed, within the past, probably the past 10 years, maybe not quite that long, there's certainly, let's say that, why not? There's been a move in that direction, away from, I think most people in the research field have given up on the idea that there's going to be some passive leaking behavior to deception. That we will scratch our nose or so on, right? Yeah. And they've moved now towards active forms of lie detection, looking for ways of prompting the liar, or potentially more importantly, prompting the truth teller to give information. And in doing that, you can differentiate who's lying and who's telling the truth.
So finding more evidence of a truth rather than evidence of a lie, which we don't really think about. And I mean, people would be gutted because I know to some extent people wish there was this kind of cool way of just looking at someone and telling if they're lying. But what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Whilst it sounds really good and whilst the movies make it seem really, really interesting, it's quite unreliable. It's the same effect that the media has on profiling, where many people think you could just look at a crime scene and go, bang, that's who we're looking for. But you've heard it from the expert here. Stop sharing that crap on Facebook and stop believing everything you read. Just because somebody looks up or touches their nose does not mean they're a liar. But Chris, you just to build on what you've said, what you have said is that verbal information and also third-hand information, if we could call it that, can be useful. So my next question is this, Chris. Based on what you've said, can you train someone then to become better? Or, I mean, you said initially, we're bad at detecting deception. What if we train somebody with the correct information? Can somebody become a reliable human lie detector?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are fairly confident that people are very bad at this. And the bigger the sample we get, the more informative we become. And we've had very big samples in this area now. So
how bad, can I ask?
So if we were to, so I'm going to give you a statement again.
Okay.
So this morning I drank 3 cups of coffee. There's a statement, right?
Yes.
Now, if you were to, you got 2 options available to you. I'm going to give you lie and truth. They're your only options. You can either guess I'm lying or telling the truth. Right?
Okay.
If you were to guess randomly, if you were to flip a coin and say if it comes up heads, I'm going to say truth. If it comes up tail, I'm going to say lie. That in the long run, if I keep saying statement over and over and over, and you keep flipping that coin to make the decision, that should come out at about 50% accuracy. So that's like getting half of them right, half of them wrong. So that's kind of that's our starting point, right? That's the worst you can do. Randomly guess.
Yeah, 50-50.
So where do we relate to this 50%? By the way, I don't drink coffee at all. I hate coffee.
I know
Um,
that because one, you mentioned tea, and before I've seen you order hot
yep,
chocolate. So
good call. There we go. Using your understanding of the situation to inform your
sure.
judgment. Yeah. So again, it's that kind of information that people actually use. It's not the non-verbal cues in the moment. They reflect on their knowledge of the world, and that's important. So yes, where were we? Statement. Kind of lost track of where we were at. What were we talking about?
How bad are people?
Yes, right. So where are they relative to this
yeah
50% rate?
yeah
Right. So 50% is pretty much as bad as you can get. 100% is perfect. We are 54% accuracy. So we are doing
interesting
ever so slightly better than flipping a coin and guessing randomly.
interesting
And
interesting.
I think that's part
Very
of the
good.
reason why this field has been so driven by the accuracy research question. It's tantalizing because it seems like we can do it better than chance, slightly better than chance, which says, hey, maybe there's something here. Maybe we can do this. But we're doing really bad. And given the obvious practical applications to, I don't know, HR interview, police interviews, military deception, cyber deception, social care, believe it or not, is a big one because parents will often deceive social workers when there's a case of serious harm to a child. We look back through those cases and we see it's come about because of deception. Um, so it has all this wide application. So the research has been geared towards how do we boost accuracy, which is kind of why, as I was alluding to before, there really hasn't been much work on the question of how do we make any decision at all, because they've been geared by that question. So given the low accuracy, that's kind of where we're at. Can training help? Well, it depends on how we're talking about this. So if we're saying training on what's available right now, passive information, then training has a mild effect at best. So it might push you up to as high as 60%, maybe, which is pretty much the ceiling. You're really probably going to get much better than that.
It's better than 51.
It is certainly better, yeah. So 54 is kind of like where we are without training, and 60 is kind of where we're at with training, we think. That's not bad.
Okay.
But it's not much. But then there's kind of the interesting additional question to that, because now we're talking about physical evidence and so on. And we're only just getting started here. And for me, this is the interesting side of things. If we're going to talk about lie detection accuracy. Because once we start moving away from this idea that there are going to be passive cues that people leak out, that we're going to pick up on and try to train on those. Once we start developing these techniques, then yes, I think we'll do very well. I think we can hit 70, 80, 90% accuracy in time. Not right now, but in time as we start developing those techniques. So there are techniques now which I would say are probably about 65% accurate. However, when you look in the published literature, they will claim they're closer to 80%. And the reason I have that discrepancy there is because the analyses they're using in those papers, I don't know, I don't want to get too technical here. But yeah, there's certain things they're doing in these analyses which mean they are very specific to the data they collected, which doesn't necessarily
rather than a general population.
Yeah. So you need to do additional things to make sure these particular things they're developing will generalize, and they haven't necessarily done that. So I would be guessing when you start doing that, that number's probably going to come down a fair bit. Yeah, but there's promise. And here's the thing: there's a study done in 2013 by a friend of mine that was just usual setup, right? So I bring you into the lab. You're going to be my liar or truth teller, and I say, if you tell the truth, you're going to have to watch the clock for 10 minutes, then you get to go. So you sat there in silence. So that's what happens if you tell the truth. If you lie, you get to leave early. Guess what? Nobody wants to sit around watching the clock for 10 minutes, right? Everyone wants to leave early. So you bring in a set of different people like yourselves to do this, and you either give them the motivation to leave early if they lie, or give them motivation to leave early if they tell the truth. So now you got a bunch of people motivated to either lie or tell the truth because they get to leave early. So I take those videos of you lying or telling the truth, show them to a new bunch of people, and I say, do your best. And people hit about chance accuracy again, about 54% accuracy.
Right.
But if I say this person was motivated such that if they lied, they could leave early, and if they told the truth, they would have to wait. Well, that information is 100% predictive. Everyone took the motivation to leave early, right? So it's a perfect piece of information. It's like Pinocchio's nose.
Yeah.
So the question is, when we have that information, can we use it? Because that's what I think is the interesting question. Not can we detect what we have available to us now, but when we start developing these techniques, will we be able to use them appropriately? When there is a good cue that we can create, can people detect it? And in that study, they found 98% accuracy rates. So they hit near perfect
That's
accuracy
incredible.
rates.
That's incredible.
Now,
but I see what you mean when you say it's not applicable to everyday lives all the time.
Yeah. So right now our techniques are not so good unless we can. Well, we want to take the effort to try and go out and find physical evidence to contradict. But yeah, right now it's tricky. So the advice right now, I guess, is potentially unexpected questions might help. If you ask your speaker something they're not anticipating, they haven't had time to prepare for, the time they might take to respond might become slightly longer, but it's rather difficult. People do seem to do a little bit better at deciding if it's a lie or truth, but it's not exactly clear why that is. So yeah, but that practically looks like it replicates, although it is all coming out mostly out of one lab, which can sometimes be a little bit worrying, which is not to say that one lab is cheating. It's that one lab can have certain setups such that they just happen to maybe present their participants with information in a particular way that happens to encourage particular behaviors that in other labs don't. That can happen, and that's why we like to generalize across labs. So that's possibly a way about it. Another way is to tell the speaker, and this is currently the most promising approach in my opinion, although it has its problems, is to say, so you can tell me a statement in a moment, but the more details you give me that I could go out and check, the more willing I am to believe you. So what that tells a truth teller is to include more checkable details. And what that means is either witnessed by another person, that's a named person. It's not just, I was at the stadium, there were 20 people. You have to tell me who that is so I could actually go and check. Or a physical piece of evidence, so like a receipt, something like this. So they're all checkable. The more of those kinds of details you include, the more likely I am to believe you. And the great thing about that is that liars can't start incorporating them, because the more things you tell me that I could go and check, I'll go out and check them. And you'll be shown to be a liar, right? Because you didn't actually do those things you're claiming you did. So you can't show things that could be checked, whereas truth tellers can. And we think the way this technique works is that it's not that it catches out the liar, it's more that it encourages the truth teller to do the right thing. Truth tellers don't realize that they need to include checkable details. So in doing this, it encourages them to provide those details. And then if you just look at the number of details, truth tellers should provide more details than liars do.
That's crazy, because it didn't even once cross my mind. As somebody who doesn't do research in this area, it makes so much sense what you're saying. It's this idea of give the truth tellers a chance to prove that they're telling the truth, rather than try to determine who is the liar. Which again, it sounds so simple, yet it's something that did not cross my mind at all. And it seems like from what you're saying, there is some utility in lie detection techniques, but it's not as simple as reading someone. It seems to be that somebody who is going to be able to detect liars and truth tellers, they have to do more than just look at someone's look at someone's behavior. They have to almost probe what they say, and it's a longer process that could potentially help them determine the likelihood that they're telling the truth or telling the lie. So that's fascinating. Thank you for that. It's been a really, really interesting talk. I've really enjoyed this. I guess before we finish off, we have loads of students watch this, and a lot of our students love to do things like this for their dissertations, whether they're undergraduates, MSc students. Many want to get into their PhD.
Yeah.
So one thing we want to do is ask you for your advice. Is there any particular areas that you advise existing students watching this right now who are wanting to do their dissertation or postgraduate research in this? Is there any area that you think is the next direction for future research?
Wow, that's a great question. That's put me on the spot, isn't it? Okay, so no, I like it. So let's see. I mean, at the moment, theories are lacking. So an understanding of how we make that decision is still lacking. So I have the adaptive lie detector theory, and that is just one perspective. But even that perspective is too simple. It says there are two bits of information you can use, either information about this statement or information about statements in general. It doesn't account for things like, what are the stakes of the lie? Does that make a difference? Do I put more motivation, more effort into it? What happens if I don't really care about detecting the lie? Do I even bother looking for bits of information? What happens when I have conflicting information? So all these kinds of questions about just very basic decision process, which is simply how do you make the decision? Not how do you make it right or how do you make it wrong? How do you get to the lie or truth decision that you made? What brought you to that point? And what affects that decision? There's lots of very basic questions in cognitive and decision-making work that just aren't being addressed in this area, like that. So that's one direction potentially if you're interested in that sort of decision-making side. If you're more interested in the accuracy side, then one of the techniques we've been talking about there was called the verifiability approach. And that's where I'm getting you to give me checkable details. That's something that certainly has some holes in it, but I don't want to talk too much about that because I'm talking with colleagues about that and they've asked me not to talk about that. But there are certainly holes within that people could overcome relatively easily. So there are ways of sort of countermeasuring these techniques. People have kind of moved away from the idea of passive cues. So I would say for a dissertation, anything like this, I would say move away from the idea of looking for cues of deception. That isn't very helpful. Instead, you're probably looking for probing techniques if you're looking for that kind of direction. Personally, as a cognitive psychologist, I always want to come back to the why. Why does this work? So if asking unanticipated questions works, why does that work? What does it do? How does it help people make the decision? So those are the kind of questions I'm interested in. In terms of moving forward the next few years, I mean, there's a debate going on about unconscious lie detection at the moment. There are some people who argue that there's good evidence for it. I'm on the other side. I argue there's really not very good evidence for this. So that debate's still ongoing. So something that could be more conclusive there would be interesting. But that's a rather tricky topic to tackle, especially in a dissertation. Yeah, but there are some thoughts.
No, that's perfect. I do appreciate that. And I know a lot of students will be interested in that. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. For those of you who are watching this, I forgot to send Chris the invitation and the time for this. So he did step in last minute due to my errors. So I do really appreciate your time. This has been one of the most enjoyable interviews I've done. That's fantastic. So you heard it from the main man. Stop claiming that you can identify liars from stupid tales, okay? Stop believing everything you read on the internet, unless it's a journal article.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate it.
No worries.
Have a great week.
Yeah, you too, man.
Appreciate it.